So thank you all for having me. It is a profound privilege to be in your presence, and I'm very happy to share with you what I have been working on in the past few years. But first, I want to give you a little bit of context. So we at World Faith are really focused on how can we end religious violence. And this led us onto a journey of discovery over the past few years, and that's what I want to share with you. So first, let's get started towards the beginning. So I grew up in the Pacific Northwest in land that was originally of the Chinook Nation, the Ka'atapa'ato, but by the time my family moved there, it was known as Battleground, Washington. And it was a very homogenous town. We grew up in the mountains outside of there, and I remember seeing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles when I was 8 years old and saying, I'm going to move to New York. When I was in middle school, my sister had the Book of Colleges. For those of you who are my age or older, you remember before the internet, you had actually got a book with all the colleges. You had to look up your, why are you applauding that? We're just old. Okay. So I looked up New York. I found New York University. I'm like, I'm going there. Never mind, my parents moved to ages 15 and 16. They had never gone to college. For me, I knew what I was going to do. And when I was 18, I moved to New York to study music business. And when I got there, I was inspired by and challenged by all the diversity and difference of people. I immediately dove into the music industry, but I'll tell you, I realized music, still even to this day for me, is my passion, but it wasn't my calling. And some of the discomfort I felt when engaging in difference led me on a journey where I went out to Egypt to conduct independent research on Christian and Muslim relations. And when I was there, I was inspired to get involved in interfaith work. But I was particularly struck, why is it young people who seem to be engaging in violence, and why is it so easy for this violence to happen? Why does it only take somebody to throw a rock through the window of a church or a mosque for 6 to be dead by morning? So when I came back to New York, and I decided I wanted to dive into this work, I found that there was plenty of work happening in spaces in terms of getting religious leaders together for dialogue, which is something I think the world needs. But there wasn't a lot focused on how do we engage young people in communities of conflict to get to know one another, to build the bridges that we need. And so it was out of that frustration that I founded World Faith. Our mission is to end religious-based violence, and our theory of change is really focused on two pieces. One, contact theory, that if you build a relationship with somebody different than you, then you will probabilistically improve how you see their whole community. Secondarily, when young people have, when young people have purpose, direction, and opportunity, they are much less likely to engage in violence. And these two truths work together, created our model, and that is World Faith Chapters. We have chapters across 8 countries in which young people are working in development projects. So we started on campus at NYU. We got our first grant through the Walmart Foundation, through the Clinton Nobel Initiative University. I got connected to other interfaith activists through the Interfaith Youth Corps. Thank you, Ibu, for all of the support over these years. And as we started moving into different communities, we found that there were lots of young people all around the world who wanted to work together to try to reduce violence. But the way that we were able to do that was actually focusing on the development projects themselves. We took on early child education in India, women's empowerment in Pakistan, public health initiatives across sub-Saharan Africa, including in Malawi. And then we even saw leaders grow out of this doing amazing work, including in Poso, where Leon Gogali leads a network of women's programs called Mosuntuwu, now working in 30 villages. Being part of this network was a really inspiring piece because I realized it was so much bigger than anything we had done in New York. This was a movement of people who were working together, and I just got to be a part of it with them. To date, World Faith has engaged over 6,000 volunteers and 300,000 hours of service, impacting the lives of roughly 500,000 people around the world. But this isn't ending religious violence. We're a drop in the bucket compared to the size of these challenges. So I want to know, do you believe, I actually want to have you raise your hands, I can see you. Can we end religious violence in a generation? Honestly. Yes. Do you really think we can? Yes. Okay, you're slightly optimistic. The few times I asked this, like, okay, yeah, I believe, sure, but like, really? So it turns out this is the answer that we usually see. I recently did a study, a survey with the Rockefeller Foundation, and they found through their work that out of all the SDGs that they were tracking, the SDG people thought was least likely to be solved in a generation was goal 16, which is peaceful and inclusive societies. Just for context, people were over double as likely to think we will end poverty at large. Okay, so this is how the world looks at what we are doing. This is what everyone thinks of this movement so far. That's really tough. When I've spent the last 10 years, many of you spent decades doing this work, this is what people tend to think of the work we're doing. And I get it. It's salient, it's searing, it's painful. Religious violence takes the lives of over 100,000 people a year. 11 of the 15 most violent conflicts in the world implicate religion. It is easy to feel dismay. And there are many reasons why this violence happens. Communal violence at large, there are psychological, neurological, biological, tons of different elements that cause violence to happen. Dunbar's number, if you're unfamiliar, is the ability of humans to maintain relationships with only 200 people on average at a time. So we are naturally tribal. The amygdala, when you are afraid, all the prefrontal cortex shuts down. You lose about 20 IQ points, and you go off your basal hunches and not weighed measures. Turns out, not only is raises in testosterone cause more violence, many of us have heard this, but drops in serotonin does. There's actually a study I saw just this week that people are looking to correlate rises in global warming to increased violence because of how the body responds chemically. There's Michael Kimmel's research in a book called Healing Beyond Hate, the idea of aggrieved entitlement of masculinity. It's super interesting, that looks at patterns of violence, particularly young men. Loss aversion, if anyone's read any Daniel Kahneman, there's a lot of reasons why this is happening. But I want to point out that this notion of tabula rasa, that we're born a blank slate, I don't buy it. There's so much wired into us that makes conflict our normal state that I actually think what we should be looking at is what is causing it when we are peaceful? Because that is actually a much more interesting question to me. So the question is, why does the world suck so much, right? So, all right, now we know that violence is this big issue and that everyone thinks that we're not going to get anywhere. So why is this? So I wanted to show you this chart. All is not lost. If you may not be able to read it, but this is your likelihood of dying in violent conflict starting in the year 1400 till today. And if you notice the blue, that's where we are now. This is the least violent time in human history. So it's not all bad, okay? And maybe you need a little more data, okay? This is your likelihood of dying in conflict. If you look down here, fourth from the bottom is conflict. If you look at drowning, you're 2.5 times more likely to die drowning than in conflict. I hope that brings you peace. It doesn't me. The point is it's not so bad. So the question is, why do we feel like we're not making any progress? I argue that the way that the amount of resources we have to solve the problem do not match the size of our problem. Our solutions are too small. We're providing Band-Aids to gunshot wounds. And in this case, this is some amazing research by the Institute of Economics and Peace. They found that the world loses $14 trillion in productivity and all the other costs because of violence. We spend over $5 trillion on military spending, but only $15 billion on peace building. So we're spending 15 cents on a $14,000 problem. Okay, that's why we feel like we're not making progress. So why are we not getting this progress? I would argue a step further that we don't have the research techniques, we're not using methodologies happening in other fields to keep pace with where the investment's going. For context, public health right now is a $6.8 trillion space. That's how much funding is going into that space. We're at 15 billion. That's a whole different comma, we're at a totally different scale. I think there are 3 main reasons why we've had these barriers. We have the challenge of low probability occurrences. I'm not going to bore you with Bayes' theorem, but the important thing here is that every single characteristic we use to talk about violence, the majority of people who meet that criteria are not violent. So if you say young men, or you list religious communities or places, or if you talk about people who've suffered abuse themselves, or even the aggrieved entitlement sort of narrative we talked about, if you put these Venn diagrams layered, you still are going to end up with a pool of people who are mostly nonviolent. Low probability is really hard to work with. Self-reporting issues. The methodology we use at World Faith, we realized, doesn't account for a lot, and this is true of best practices, I believe, at our field at large. We're using self-reported data. Sure, we can give sentences instead of questions, rank them with sensitivity numbers, but if we look at Daniel Kahneman's work and the work of other behavioral researchers, what people say they're going to do, what they actually do has low correlation. You have the sociability effect, the Hawthorne effect. There's many challenges that happen that make it tough to treat that as viable data. And lastly, there's a huge challenge in our space of generalizability. And what I mean is that when we learn something in one place, we assume that we can't apply it into another, or we're using techniques that make it impossible to do so. We can't make general statements at this time based on research and violence. So I want to take this on. And the way that we want to do this at World Faith is to look at the issue of predictive modeling of peace-building outcomes. So I want to be specific of what I mean here. An outcome is not how many people go through your program. That's usually referred to as an output. What I want to know is how are those people changed, and can we forecast that out? Specifically, when you look at, for instance, investing or putting philanthropy into an issue like vaccines, you need to know who needs it, how long does it last, what is the minimal effective dose, the rate of infection before, the rate of infection after, and what it will cost. And you can actually forecast the impact of those programs. We do not yet have that ability. I believe the way that we get there is through these 4 steps. One is we need to conduct new behavioral research to have a heuristic for violence that we can use in the field that accounts for these social and self-reporting challenges. We have already teamed up with researchers from UMass Lowell and at UPenn to put together a 3-year research project. We've submitted a proposal for this. We're really excited about working in this new space. It's something that's new for us. 2, using something called collective impact assessment approach. We want to get to the largest players in the peace-building field to sit with us. 2 of them already agreed to work on this in some sort of capacity, so we're making progress on this. To gather data using these sets of measures in a uniform way across many programs. And what this will enable us to do is to then be able to analyze that data because it's consistent. Right now, the way that impact's measured in each organization is different. Therefore, we can't compare anything. But if we had a large data set with enough skew collected in a uniform way, we could actually run multivariable regressional analysis or tri-system modeling, a lot of different data science approaches that could really help us. And lastly, and this is really important to me, the finished product needs to be something that non-technical people can use for free to get that. So I want to, yeah. So I'll get a step into that. In the first phase, we're looking at, as I just mentioned, where we can do this. We're looking at Nigeria and Pakistan. For those of you who are nerds, that's some of the details of how we want to do the study. In phase 2, we're, as I just mentioned, the number of projects, the skew of that data, meaning we need not just lots of pieces, but we want to have it different sizes, different numbers, different parameters. And the data we want to actually use is quite important. It's not just the individual information of the behavioral data. We also want to have cohort data, number of contact hours, measure of diversity within the cohort, type of project they're doing, this sort of stuff. And then we're looking at teaming up with people like the Institute of Economics and Peace to get environmental data. What's happening in the community at large in terms of risk assessment, and does that actually factor into the likelihood of violence? The analysis, ideally, we want to give to separate groups of data scientists to analyze separately and then bring them back together, which would be really interesting for open source approaches. And lastly, the application. It needs to be able to actually create forecasts, not just analysis. Hopefully one day with insight, so we can actually then make suggestions. If you increase your contact hours by 5%, you'll see a further 4% drop in violence. We don't have this information today. It needs to be easy to use, so not just us, but we can send it into the field for people to be able to apply, and it has to be free. So this is a chart of smallpox infections from basically the past 100 years. And I want you to notice something at the very end. Do you see anything there? So in the last century, over 300 million people died of smallpox. For context, all war was roughly just over 100 million. This no longer exists as a problem, right? That's progress that took science, that took a lot of investment, a lot of time, a lot of hard work, people in the field to make this a reality. And it took many generations. I am eager to see, can we do this in our own fields? That requires catalytic philanthropy, which means people who are investing in something that know that it's likely to fail, but if it succeeds, the payoff would be substantial. We need huge amounts of collaboration among peace-building organizations to do this work together. And lastly, we actually need to get this in the hands of the people who can put that information to use. And so when I talk about this, I want you to think. I got to do a little data analysis, actually, of the parliament and found out the average age of participants is 56 years old, with a standard deviation of 11 years, which means 97.5% of you are older than me, just for fun. So I was once talking to a friend of mine about a struggle, my friend Mary, about what can I do in terms of like the impact I'm trying to have and my own work and effective altruism and blah, blah, blah. And she's like, well, who are you supporting? And I was like, well, what do you mean? She's like, well, everyone always says they're standing on the shoulders of giants. But Frank, who are you preparing your shoulders for? And so I ask you, a generation from now, not everyone in this room will still be here. What of our generation of folks is going to be our legacy in the interfaith and peace-building fields? I don't know, but I invite you to take part of this and see if we can make something amazing happen. Thank you.